The first punch landed before Marcus Vale could explain why a $20 chip appeared beneath his chair. Casino security dragged the black accountant through a private corridor, smashed his face against a steel table, and demanded he confess to theft. Marcus never fought back. He only watched the cameras, memorized every badge, and asked one quiet question: had their licensing board ever seen this room? They laughed until he revealed the sealed financial file inside his briefcase. By sunrise, their $700 million casino license deal was frozen. Federal auditors were at the doors, and every executive who approved the beating was trapped with nowhere left to run. Marcus Vale walked into Crown Meridian Casino on a crowded Friday night, wearing a plain gray suit and carrying a worn leather briefcase, exchanging exactly $100 for chips like any other tired traveler looking to unwind. To the pit bosses and cocktail waitresses, he looked like nothing more than a businessman blowing off steam after a long week. In truth, he was completing the final stage of a confidential review, ordered before Crown Meridian could be approved for a new resort license worth $700 million. That approval would hand the corporation control of 3 major resorts, 2 hotels, and a sprawling convention center throughout the city of Silver Ridge. Vanessa Whitlock had spent months telling reporters the project would create thousands of jobs for a struggling town. But the Nevada Gaming Control Board had quietly noticed unexplained money moving through Crown Meridian's accounts and needed someone they trusted to look closer before signing anything. Marcus was that person, and nobody inside the building knew it. He had been asked to observe firsthand how the casino handled cash chips high rollers and the suspicious transaction reports that were supposed to be filed with regulators. He chose a blackjack table near the roped-off high-limit room because he noticed staff quietly passing trays of chips that never appeared in the nightly count. A junior auditor named Tessa Monroe recognized him instantly from a photograph the board chairwoman had shown her weeks earlier, and she started walking toward him to make contact before her supervisor, Grant Hollis, called her away to handle an unrelated fire drill. Moments later, a man in a gray jacket brushed past Marcus, a little too deliberately, and within seconds, a single $20 chip appeared on the carpet beneath his chair, as if it had always been there. Brock Harlan and 4 security officers converged on him immediately, never once asking where the chip had come from, only insisting he had lifted it from the table beside him. Marcus calmly asked them to pull the camera footage, and Brock refused without hesitation. Marcus pointed out that every chip carried an internal tracking code and could be traced back to the exact tray it left, a fact that seemed to annoy Brock more than it concerned him. Brock ordered his men to cuff Marcus right there on the casino floor, while dozens of guests lifted their phones to record the scene, prompting security to quickly block the view and hustle him through a door marked staff only. As they pushed him down the corridor, Marcus caught a glimpse of the man in the gray jacket, slipping something into his palm from a floor supervisor, a small transaction that told him everything he needed to know. This was never a misunderstanding over $20. It was a manufactured excuse designed to separate him from witnesses and cameras before anyone could ask the obvious question. When the heavy steel door finally sealed shut behind them, Brock yanked the briefcase out of his hands and sneered that cameras did not protect people like him in this part of the building. Marcus glanced toward a small lens tucked into the corner of the ceiling. One Brock clearly did not know, still functioned, and answered quietly that it might not protect him, but it would certainly bury the men standing in front of him. The security office sat 2 floors beneath the casino, in a space that appeared on no official blueprint anyone outside the building had ever seen. Brock slid a prepared confession across the table, a document stating that Marcus had stolen the chip-resisted arrest and agreed to waive any right to complain in exchange for his release. Marcus refused to sign it and asked instead for the police and an attorney, prompting Brock to laugh and explain that local officers typically let the casino handle small thefts on its own without involvement. A guard named Wade Mercer emptied Marcus's wallet, taking his phone, his cards, and his identification, though the specialized credential hidden in the lining of his briefcase went unnoticed for the moment. Brock demanded to know why an accountant would be sitting so close to the high-limit tables, writing notes about which games were running, and Marcus offered only that he was simply observing how the casino operated that evening. That answer convinced Brock that Marcus was either working for a rival property or digging for a story, and either possibility made him angry enough to throw the first punch when Marcus again asked to see the recording. Wade shoved his face into the steel table, afterwards splitting his eyebrow open, and still Marcus refused to fight back, understanding that any resistance would only give them a story about an aggressive guest attacking staff. Instead, he studied everything around him with total precision, noting the badge numbers on each uniform, the placement of the wall clock, the positions of two hidden cameras, old bloodstains near the drain in the floor, a filing cabinet labeled guest resolution, and a paper shredder that was still warm from recent use. Blood dripped steadily onto the collar of his shirt, and he let it fall, without reaching to wipe it away, aware that every mark on his body would eventually become part of the record he intended to build. He counted the ceiling tiles once then, again forcing his breathing to slow, refusing to let panic cloud the details he needed to remember. A second guard he had not noticed before stood near the door holding a radio, occasionally muttering a code word that Marcus filed away without reacting. He recognized immediately that this was not a spontaneous overreaction, but a system that had clearly been running for a very long time, one built with the same discipline as any other department inside the casino, complete with its own procedures, its own paperwork, and its own chain of command. When brought, and Marcus warned him that the envelope belonged to a state regulatory agency and should not be touched. Brock assumed he was bluffing and reached to tear it open, just as Nolan Prescott called down from upstairs, having already pulled up a copy of Marcus's driver's license, and discovered he had once testified in a federal money laundering case years earlier. Nolan ordered Brock to stop hitting him, but did not order his release, wanting first to understand exactly who had hired this man and what he was investigating. Brock shifted tactics from violence to threats, telling Marcus he could easily be charged with fraud, assault, and disorderly conduct unless he named whoever had sent him into the casino that night. Marcus asked only one question in response, wondering aloud whether the licensing board had any idea that this room even existed, and the entire security team burst out laughing at the suggestion. Brock told him the license would be signed within 48 hours, and that no one in the world had the authority to stop it now that the paperwork was already moving through the system. Marcus looked directly at him and said he had just assaulted the one person with enough standing to recommend freezing that very vote, and for one brief second, the room went completely silent before Brock laughed again and swung a second time. Nolan came down personally after that, choosing words and pressure over fists, understanding that violence left marks while paperwork rarely did. He offered Marcus $50,000 to sign a statement, claiming his injuries came from an accidental fall, and when Marcus refused without blinking, Nolan doubled the offer, then doubled it again to $250,000. Marcus still would not sign anything, and his composure under that kind of pressure convinced Nolan he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than an ordinary accountant. Nolan tried a different approach, softening his tone, and speaking of the good to the resort would bring to Silver Ridge, the construction jobs, the tax revenue, the families who depended on the casino industry for their livelihood, as though a large enough vision could excuse a locked room and a bleeding man chained to a table. Marcus listened without interrupting, then asked whether any of those families knew a hidden interrogation room existed, 2 floors beneath the slot machines they walked past every day. Nolan had no answer for that, and for the first time that night, his confidence flickered. He ordered Wade to search the briefcase more thoroughly, and this time Wade discovered a hidden compartment holding a forensic investigator's credential, a formal authorization from the Gaming Control Board, an evidence preservation order, a list naming 37 shell companies tied to Crown Meridian, and an encrypted storage device. Nolan's face drained of color the moment he saw Celeste Warren's signature on the authorization letter, realizing this man was not simply a witness, but an officially deputized part of the license review itself. Marcus did not have the unilateral power to cancel the deal, but his final report was a mandatory condition before the board could even hold its vote, which meant assaulting him could easily be framed as obstruction, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation all at once. Nolan immediately ordered the handcuffs removed and called for the casino's in-house medical staff. But Marcus refused their help, outright demanding state police and independent ambulance, and the board chairwoman herself. Nolan tried to smooth things over, insisting this had been a simple mistake made by overzealous junior staff. But when Marcus asked whether he was prepared to hand over the original unedited footage, Nolan claimed the cameras in that particular room had been broken for months. Marcus calmly noted that the transmission light on the hidden unit was still blinking, meaning the footage was not stored on the normal security network at all, but streaming to a private server somewhere else entirely. Brock turned toward Wade with a look of dawning horror, realizing Marcus had just uncovered the very surveillance system Crown Meridian used to blackmail its most valuable guests. Upstairs, Vanessa Whitlock was celebrating at a rooftop event, having just secured a commitment from a wavering board member when news of the incident finally reached her. The instant she heard the name Marcus Vale, she remembered him clearly, since a report he authored 2 years earlier had cost a major bank more than $90 million in federal penalties. She ordered the footage erased immediately, told her people to keep Marcus contained, and demanded his storage device be confiscated before anyone else could see it. Nolan warned her that destroying evidence now would constitute obstruction at the federal level, and Vanessa answered coldly that without the footage, this was simply the word of a man arrested over $20 against an entire corporation. Just as Wade reached to pull the drive from the server, the monitor flashed red with a warning reading remote evidence mirror active, and Marcus smiled, telling them that every second they held him here, another copy of everything was already being transmitted somewhere far outside their reach. Vanessa came down to the basement herself, flanked by Grant Hollis and a small team of lawyers, and though she noticed the blood on Marcus's face, she offered no apology whatsoever, asking instead exactly how much data he had copied. Marcus said nothing in response. She tried turning the situation into a negotiation offering to cover his medical costs, pay him $1 million in damages, and fire Brock right there in front of him as a gesture of good faith. Marcus understood immediately that Brock was merely a tool, and that the person who built this entire system of violence and intimidation was standing right in front of him, wearing an expensive dress and a practiced smile. He asked her why a $20 chip required 5 security officers to drag a paying customer into a hidden room, and Vanessa insisted he had simply been chosen at random that evening. Marcus studied her face while she spoke, noting how easily the lie left her mouth, how her hands remained perfectly still, even as Grant beside her could not stop fidgeting with his cufflinks. She spoke of her charity galas, her scholarship program for local students, the hospital wing that bore her family's name, as if reciting a list of good deeds could somehow balance against the blood still drying above his eye. Marcus let her finish before responding, understanding that people who built their reputation on generosity often believed it purchased them a kind of permanent immunity. Marcus revealed that the chip carried a batch code belonging to an undeclared reserve that never appeared in the casino's official financial filings, proof that whoever planted it beneath his chair knew exactly what he had been sent there to investigate. Grant reacted visibly at the mention of the batch code, accidentally confirming its existence before he could stop himself, and Marcus quietly filed that reaction away as its own piece of evidence. He explained that Crown Meridian appeared to be running 2 separate chip systems side by side, one reported honestly to regulators, and another operating entirely off the books to move value between VIP clients, shell companies, and unnamed intermediaries. Those hidden chips were cashed out through private tables designed to avoid the large transaction reporting requirements that every legitimate casino was legally bound to follow. Marcus had already traced more than $86 million flowing through this exact system over the previous 18 months, a number precise enough to make Grant visibly flinch again. The $700 million license was never just about opening another casino floor. It was the gateway to a much larger financial network, one that would let hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit money get quietly laundered through resort revenue for years to come. Vanessa denied everything and ordered her staff to seize his files outright. But Marcus warned her that the documents were protected under a federal preservation order, and tampering with them would automatically trigger an alert directly to The board. Grant, panicking, wanted Marcus released immediately, but Vanessa refused, terrified that letting him walk out before the vote would give him every opportunity to speak publicly about what he had found. She instructed Nolan to build an entirely different story, instead one where Marcus arrived intoxicated, stole a chip, attacked a guard, and injured himself resisting arrest, while Brock would be quietly suspended just long enough to make the corporation appear responsible to outside observers. The public cameras would be edited to show only Marcus being escorted away conveniently, leaving out any footage of the man in the gray jacket planting the chip in the first place. From the surveillance office upstairs, Tessa listened to every word of this plan and realized with a sick certainty that Vanessa was fully prepared to let an innocent man take the fall for a crime engineered entirely by her own staff. She quietly copied the camera logs and chip records onto a personal storage drive before anyone noticed she was still connected to the network. Tessa had first noticed irregularities in the revenue reports 8 months earlier, when large sums of cash appeared at the end of each quarter and then vanished from the books just before filings went out to regulators. When she raised questions about it, Grant instructed her simply to reclassify the discrepancies as promotional credit and move on without asking further. Digging deeper, she discovered dozens of guests who had been taken down to that same hidden interrogation room over the years. Most accused of stealing trivial amounts, ranging from $10 to $100, before being pressured into signing away any right to sue. Some were ordinary tourists, while others were employees, vendors, or auditors who had simply seen something they were never meant to notice. One file belonged to a dealer who had questioned why certain chip trays never matched the nightly count, and within a week he had resigned, suddenly citing personal reasons that none of his coworkers believed. Another belonged to a delivery driver who noticed the same unmarked van arriving at the loading dock every Thursday night long after regular deliveries had ended. The room was never really about punishing petty theft at all. It existed purely to silence anyone who might become inconvenient for Crown Meridian's finances. A machine calibrated to make ordinary people doubt their own instincts and walk away quietly, rather than risk their safety over what seemed in the moment like a small and unprovable suspicion. Tessa eventually found 214 files under the label Guest Resolution, including 73, nearly identical, forced confessions, 41 secret payouts, 18 cases where the victim required hospital treatment, and 9 employees who simply disappeared from the payroll shortly after being questioned. There were also dozens of recordings kept specifically to intimidate high-value clients into continued silence and cooperation. She tried sending an encrypted message to Celeste Warren, but the internal network blocked the connection entirely, forcing her to physically carry the drive down toward the basement herself. Brock spotted her in the service corridor and gave chase, and Tessa ducked into a financial storage room where she found crates of paperwork already being staged for removal. That same night, each one labeled with the name of a shell company from Marcus's own list. She photographed everything and sent the images out over her personal cellular connection before Brock caught up to her. Down in the interrogation room, Marcus applied quiet pressure on Grant, reciting the exact transactions he had hidden with such precision that Grant realized the investigation had gone far further than anyone at Crown Meridian understood. Marcus told him plainly that Vanessa intended to sacrifice him the moment things fell apart, since Grant's signature appeared on every falsified report, while Vanessa's name touched only broad, deniable summaries. Grant wavered, but still could not bring himself to turn against her outright. Tessa eventually triggered a fire alarm near the kitchen to create enough chaos that the automatic security doors briefly unlocked, allowing her to slip down into the basement corridor at last. She found a medical technician who had just been called down to examine Marcus and quietly handed off the storage drive, begging the woman to carry it out of the building before anyone realized what she was holding. Brock intercepted them at the elevator, snatching the drive out of the technician's hand and preparing to crush it under his boot without a second thought. Tessa stepped out of the shadows and told him he could destroy that copy if he wanted, but the original had already reached the board 3 full minutes earlier. Vanessa, furious, ordered her held as well, and Nolan began preparing charges, accusing Tessa of stealing confidential corporate data for her own benefit. Tessa admitted openly that she had gathered the files insisting they proved systematic financial crime and organized violence rather than any wrongdoing on her part. Vanessa threatened to end her career entirely, promising lawsuits that would bankrupt her and ensure no company in the industry would ever hire her again. Marcus advised Tessa not to argue the point at all, telling her to say one clear sentence directly into the nearest camera, instead stating simply that she believed evidence was currently at risk of being destroyed. That single sentence legally established a preservation obligation the moment it was spoken aloud. Brock was ordered to cut power to the entire basement level, but Marcus reminded him that shutting down systems immediately after a witness's formal statement would itself become direct evidence of obstruction. Nolan tried once more to talk Vanessa down, but she remained convinced she still controlled local police and the outcome of the vote. What she did not know was that the medical technician had already placed an emergency call the moment she saw Marcus's injuries. A call automatically routed to state police because the casino sat inside a specially designated jurisdiction. 2 state troopers arrived in the lobby, demanding to see the injured man, only to be told by casino security that Marcus had already left the premises entirely. Tessa activated the internal intercom system from a nearby control panel and broadcast Marcus's own recorded voice through the hallway speakers, stating clearly that he was being held in the eastern basement against his will. The troopers demanded immediate access, and when Brock refused, citing sensitive business documents, they warned him a search warrant would follow within the hour. Vanessa realized her window was closing fast and offered to release Marcus immediately in exchange for every piece of data he carried along with his signature on a strict confidentiality agreement. Marcus asked only for his phone back, and Vanessa agreed, believing the device had already been locked down and every outgoing connection severed. Marcus typed in an emergency code that routed the call directly to Celeste Warren through a prearranged secure line, and he offered her only 4 essential facts. He had been set up with a planted $20 chip, he had been physically assaulted while performing his assigned duties, to the casino was currently holding a witness against her will, and financial records were at immediate risk of destruction. Celeste asked no further questions. She convened an emergency session of the board within minutes, and citing her authority to protect the integrity of an active investigation, signed an order immediately suspending the entire license review process. The full $700 million transaction froze instantly. Banks financing the deal received automatic notifications and halted every scheduled disbursement. Real estate partners paused pending land transfers, and major shareholders demanded urgent explanations from Vanessa's office. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, with cancellation notices, credit freezes, and evidence preservation demands arriving one after another. Marcus looked at her calmly and said she had gambled $700 million trying to hide a single $20 chip. Her phone buzzed once more, displaying a message stating the license review had been suspended effective immediately. Marcus and Tessa were escorted out by state police, with Marcus taken to a hospital to have his injuries formally documented. Crown Meridian immediately issued a press statement, calling Marcus a disgruntled consultant who had attempted to steal proprietary company data, releasing carefully edited footage that showed only him leaning near a gaming table before. Security approached, conveniently omitting any trace of the man in the gray jacket. Vanessa appeared before cameras, insisting the corporation had zero tolerance for violence, and that Brock had already been suspended pending review while privately relocating him to another hotel, entirely paying him quietly and instructing him to accept full responsibility if it ever came to the place. That Nolan sent Marcus a settlement offer worth $5 million contingent on withdrawing his report, staying silent about the interrogation room, publicly admitting to a misunderstanding, avoiding the press entirely, and dropping any claim against the company. Marcus refused, without hesitation, recognizing exactly what Vanessa was attempting, turning a case of organized financial crime into nothing more than a private civil dispute between 2 individuals. He told Nolan plainly that no amount of money could buy back the silence of the other victims whose files Tessa had already found, and that every day the settlement remained unsigned was another day the truth stayed alive. Nolan raised the offer once more, this time to $8 million, framing it as a final and generous gesture, but Marcus simply set the phone down without responding, understanding that the size of the number only proved how frightened they had become. Meanwhile, Grant began quietly moving documents out of headquarters, hiring an outside shredding company to remove dozens of boxes under cover of routine cleanup. Tessa supplied Marcus with the truck's license plate and its scheduled route, while federal investigator Everett Sloan joined the case alongside his anti-money laundering unit, though they still needed stronger evidence to obtain a passus warrant for the entire financial system. The footage of Marcus being assaulted proved obstruction, but it was not enough on its own to establish an $86 million laundering operation. Vanessa leaned hard on her political connections, pressuring two board members with promises to revive the project and restore thousands of jobs if only they would remove Celeste from her position overseeing the case. Local coverage grew divided, with some outlets portraying Marcus as a victim of corporate violence, while others suggested he was trying to sabotage a major economic opportunity for personal gain. Marcus ignored the noise entirely and stayed focused on the numbers, discovering a critical flaw in Grant's records, showing that shell company transfers consistently landed in casino accounts exactly 11 minutes before the daily reporting system closed each night. If he could obtain a minute-by-minute copy of the server data, he could prove the reports themselves had been automatically manipulated. Tessa then revealed that the backup server was not housed inside the casino at all, but sat inside an old abandoned Crown Meridian resort out in the desert. Everett checked the property records and discovered the building had already been scheduled for demolition the following morning. Marcus said quietly that Vanessa was never planning to simply delete the data. She intended to bring down the entire building that contained it. Everett rushed to secure a warrant, but the judge required proof the server truly existed at that remote location before authorizing a search. Tessa remembered that the shuttered resort's electric bill had remained unusually high despite sitting empty for 3 years, and Marcus used the utility records to demonstrate the property was still running an industrial-scale cooling system, exactly the kind needed to support a working data center. The judge signed an emergency warrant just before dawn, and Everett led his team out to the property with Marcus and Tessa, accompanying them as data forensic specialists. Vanessa learned of the warrant through an internal source and immediately called Brock, ordering him to reach the site first, remove the drives, and trigger the demolition sequence regardless of the timing. Brock and 2 of his men arrived by truck and began forcing open the server room door while the federal team was still minutes away. Tessa guided Everett through a rear maintenance entrance, since the front had already been sealed by an internal security system. Marcus noticed the data transmission signal steadily weakening as Brock pulled individual drive clusters from the server racks one by one. The investigators reached the room just as Brock finished loading the drives into his truck, and when he tried fleeing through the old theater section of the property, he shoved an investigator to the ground and manually triggered the property demolition timer. Dust drifted down from the ceiling as old support beams groaned under decades of neglect, and the abandoned slot machines still lining the gutted casino floor rattled faintly with each distant charge, already beginning to arm itself. An alarm sounded through the building, giving everyone only minutes to clear the structure, its shrill tone bouncing off empty hallways that had once been filled with the sound of coins and laughter, now hollow and stripped down to bare concrete and exposed wiring. Marcus realized the detonation controller ran on the same internal network and quickly accessed the administrative panel, discovering Grant had reused his own personal password to secure it. He managed to cancel the remote signal, but one section had already been armed manually and could not be stopped in time. Everett chased Brock through the corridor, while Tessa raced to copy what data remained before losing access entirely. Part of the ceiling collapsed, blocking the main exit, forcing Marcus to find an old cash transport tunnel connecting the server room directly to the parking area outside. Everyone escaped moments before the western wing of the old resort came down in a controlled collapse. Brock was arrested at the perimeter fence, carrying 14 recovered drives, $320,000 in cash, a forged passport, a liability waiver prepared by Nolan, and text messages, proving Vanessa's direct orders throughout the entire operation. The recovered server data revealed the full scope of the hidden chip system, hours of interrogation footage, and a complete history of every falsified financial report the company had filed. Tessa opened one encrypted folder labeled Protection Detail and found video of Vanessa personally reviewing recordings of past assaults and approving a running list of people who needed to be, in her words, handled. Marcus said quietly that Brock had never lost control that night. He had simply been following the exact procedure Vanessa herself had built. The board scheduled an emergency hearing broadcast publicly, and Vanessa arrived with a large legal team, still insisting Brock had acted entirely on his own, without any direction from leadership. Nolan argued that the recovered server data had been obtained illegally and that Tessa had violated her confidentiality obligations by removing it in the first place. Celeste dismissed the argument, outright confirming the search warrant had been lawfully issued and that whistleblower protections applied fully to evidence of active criminal conduct. Marcus arrived with stitches still visible above his eye, but chose to lead with the numbers rather than his own injuries. He laid out the full financial structure for the board, step by step, showing how shell companies funneled money into intermediary accounts, converted it into undocumented chips, ran it through fabricated high roller tables, recorded it as legitimate gambling revenue, and then extracted it again as clean profit refunds or consulting fees, all while suspicious transactions were quietly stripped from the reports sent to regulators. He proved that more than $86 million had passed through this exact structure, walking the board through spreadsheet after spreadsheet until even the members least familiar with forensic accounting understood the pattern staring back at them. He explained how each shell company existed only on paper, sharing the same handful of registered addresses, the same recycled officer, names the same small pool of attorneys who filed their incorporation documents within days of each other. Then he displayed the tracking code from the $20 chip planted beneath his own chair, showing it belonged precisely to the undocumented reserve batch he had been sent to investigate in the first place. Proof the setup had never been random at all, but pulled directly from the evidence he was already chasing. Tessa testified about the 214 guest resolution files and the broader pattern of witness intimidation across years of operation. A recovered recording captured Brock asking Vanessa what to do about an employee who had witnessed a suspicious transfer and her cold response instructing him to find a chip and let the man turn himself into a criminal. That single recording proved the tactic used against Marcus had been employed against others many times before. Grant was called to testify, and initially denied everything until Everett produced messages between Grant and Vanessa discussing the destruction of the server, at which point Grant realized she had already prepared documents designed to shift all responsibility onto him alone. He changed his testimony completely, confirming that Vanessa ordered the creation of the second chip system, that Nolan drafted every silence agreement, that Brock dealt with anyone who refused to cooperate, that Grant himself falsified the financial reports, and that several local officials had accepted gifts and consulting payments in exchange for their cooperation. His voice shook as he named each official individually, describing envelopes of cash exchanged during charity dinners and free sweets offered to inspectors who conveniently overlooked irregularities during their annual reviews. He admitted he had known for years that something was deeply wrong, but told the board that fear of losing everything he had built kept him signing whatever Vanessa placed in front of him. A confession that drew a long, uncomfortable silence from the room before Celeste finally spoke again. Nolan attempted to leave the hearing, but was stopped immediately by federal investigators waiting near the exit. Celeste asked Vanessa directly whether she still maintained this was simply the act of one employee acting alone, and Vanessa refused to answer, honestly warning, instead, that killing the project would devastate the entire local economy. Marcus responded that no city could build its future on dirty money, and the silence of people too frightened to speak. Celeste ruled that the evidence demonstrated Crown Meridian had failed every standard of honesty, accountability, and financial transparency required for licensing. She announced that the $700 million application was permanently denied, and moments later, Everett Sloan approached Vanessa with a formal arrest warrant in hand. Vanessa Whitlock was charged with conspiracy to launder money, financial fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, ordering the destruction of evidence, bribing public officials, and conspiracy to assault and intimidate a witness. Brock Harlan faced charges for assault, unlawful detention, obstruction of justice, and attempting to destroy evidence, while Nolan Prescott was charged with assisting a criminal enterprise drafting fraudulent documents and pressuring witnesses into silence. Grant Hollis signed a formal cooperation agreement, and though he still faced criminal liability of his own, his testimony helped investigators trace every dollar and every official who had accepted a bribe along the way. Crown Meridian lost operational control of the casino entirely, with an independent administrator appointed to protect employees and remaining assets during the ongoing investigation. Banks withdrew from the deal. Investors filed lawsuits against the company's leadership, and its stock collapsed within days, wiping out a significant portion of the retirement funds that had quietly held large blocks of Crown Meridian shares for years. Analysts who once praised Vanessa's expansion strategy now scrambled to explain how such a sprawling scheme had gone unnoticed for so long, and several called for stricter oversight of privately held gaming corporations across the entire state. More than 100 former victims who had been dragged into that hidden interrogation room over the years came together to file a joint civil lawsuit against the corporation, many speaking publicly for the first time about experiences they had carried in silence for years, convinced until now that no one would ever believe them over a company with so much money and influence. The recovered footage proved that many others had been set up with planted chips, just like Marcus, and several old criminal cases were reopened. After it became clear, local police had relied on falsified reports. The casino itself had manufactured. Tessa was formally recognized as a protected whistleblower, turned down an offer to work for a rival casino corporation, and instead joined a specialized auditing unit inside the regulatory agency itself, where she spent her first year training new investigators to recognize the exact patterns she had once been too afraid to report. She often told them that fear inside a large organization rarely announced itself loudly, that it usually arrived quietly disguised as a reasonable explanation from a supervisor asking one more question to be set aside for later. Celeste pushed through sweeping reforms across the entire industry, requiring every private security room to be registered, banning hidden off-network video storage, mandating that any in-house arrest be reported directly to police, requiring real-time tracking for every gaming chip, protecting whistleblowers from retaliation, and mandating independent review of any accusation involving small-scale theft. She testified before state lawmakers herself, describing in detail how easily a system built to protect guests had instead been turned into a weapon against them, and how a single unregistered room beneath a casino floor had operated for years without a single outside authority ever questioning its existence. Several other gaming corporations, fearing similar scrutiny, quietly began auditing their own security practices long before the new regulations officially took effect. Marcus refused every offer of hush money throughout the process, choosing instead to pursue a civil case against Crown Meridian, while directing the majority of any settlement toward a fund supporting others who had suffered under that same hidden security system. During the civil proceedings, an attorney asked him why he never fought back the night Brock struck him. Marcus answered that fighting back would have handed them exactly the story they wanted, a dangerous man attacking casino security, rather than the truth of what had actually happened. He explained that he had spent years watching powerful institutions rewrite the narrative around the very people they harmed, and he refused to give Crown Meridian a single frame of footage that could be twisted into justification. He chose instead to remember to observe and to let the evidence eventually speak for itself, trusting that precision and patience would outlast any story built on fear. Months later, Marcus returned to the same building, now stripped of its Crown Meridian signage, its basement interrogation room sealed off and preserved as part of the ongoing federal case file. Tessa met him there and handed him the original $20 chip, now sealed inside an evidence bag, destined for a training program for new financial investigators. The label attached to the bag read simply that this was the item which began the entire Crown Meridian investigation. Marcus held the small chip in his hand for a long moment, thinking about how Vanessa had once believed $20 was too small an amount for anyone to ever question, and how she had believed a single accusation could destroy a man's reputation, while $700 million could buy the silence of an entire city. She had spent her entire career learning how to control rooms, boardrooms, courtrooms, and newsrooms alike, but she had never once considered that the quietest man in the building might be the one keeping score the whole time. That same arrogance was exactly what led her to choose the wrong target. Marcus placed the chip back into the evidence bag and said quietly that they had once believed it was worth only $20. Tessa asked what it turned out to be worth in the end. Marcus looked up at the empty casino tower, now standing under federal oversight, and answered that to them it had cost $700 million and the entire empire they had built around it.